What happens when the sneaker industry sees something it has never seen before in women's basketball? Not a feel-good moment, not a viral clip, hard data, sales numbers so unexpected they stopped conversations inside boardrooms. And at the center of it all was Caitlin Clark. For decades, brands treated women's basketball shoes as a side project. Limited runs, modest expectations, safe bets. But early in 2026, internal reports at Nike told a very different story. Clark's player exclusives weren't just selling well, they were overperforming by margins that forced executives to reevaluate everything they thought they knew about demand. And here's the part almost no one talks about. These weren't even her signature shoes yet. No CC1, no official launch, just player exclusives in Indiana Fever colors. Yet NBA players, athletes with access to any footwear they want, were reportedly asking Nike if they could get their hands on her colorways. That had never happened before, ever. Suddenly, sneaker forums were melting down. Sites crashed during drops. Resale prices doubled and tripled within hours. Screenshots of failed checkout attempts flooded social media. This wasn't hype manufactured by marketing. This was raw demand breaking through a ceiling the industry assumed was permanent. And when Nike's analytics team started comparing Clark's numbers to established signature lines, including male athletes with championships and MVPs, the conversations inside the company changed fast. This wasn't just about one player anymore. It was about realizing the market for women's basketball had been underestimated for decades. Because once a brand like Nike sees proof instead of potential, nothing stays the same. And what followed didn't just reshape Clark's career, it quietly rewrote the future of women's basketball forever. Inside Nike, product performance reviews are usually routine. Sales are compared to projections, regional demand gets mapped out, and teams move on to the next cycle. But when the first full reports for Caitlin Clark's women's basketball footwear hit executive desks, that routine disappeared fast. At first glance, the numbers didn't make sense. Clark's player exclusives weren't supposed to lead the category. They weren't backed by a full signature rollout. There was no massive retail saturation, no global campaign announcing a new era. These were limited PE releases tied to a rookie WNBA player. Historically, that kind of product performs modestly, spikes briefly, then fades. That's how the model has always worked. Except this time, it didn't. Clark's PEs didn't just sell out, they sold out immediately. Demand wasn't concentrated in one region or one demographic either. Nike's internal breakdowns reportedly showed interest coming from sneaker collectors, casual basketball fans, women's sports supporters, and most surprisingly, core basketball consumers who traditionally ignore women's releases altogether. That overlap almost never happens. What really raised eyebrows was the velocity. Units moved faster than expected even after Nike adjusted supply. When restocks dropped, they vanished just as quickly. Forecast models had to be rewritten mid-cycle because prior assumptions no longer applied. For industry veterans, that's the moment when instinct kicks in and people stop asking, "Why is this happening?" and start asking, "How big is this really?" The timing made it even more jarring. This wasn't a championship run. This wasn't a viral moment during March Madness. Clark's signature shoe hadn't even been announced yet. And still, her name alone was driving consumer behavior in a way Nike hadn't documented before in women's basketball. Internally, comparisons started happening almost immediately. Not publicly, but quietly. Clark's PE performance was lined up next to early-stage data from established signature athletes, not just WNBA players, everyone. And according to people familiar with those discussions, the gap wasn't small enough to ignore or explain away as a fluke. That's when the tone changed. This stopped being viewed as a successful launch and started being treated as a signal that the ceiling Nike had placed on women's basketball footwear might have been wrong all along. And once a company like Nike realizes its own expectations were too low, the response isn't subtle. Because the next question wasn't whether Clark was selling shoes. It was whether the entire category had been misunderstood, and what would happen if Nike finally treated it like it mattered. This is the moment the story crossed a line. No one thought women's basketball would reach this fast. Because inside sneaker culture, there's one signal that matters more than hype, marketing, or resale prices: what professional players actually choose to wear when no one is forcing them to. And that's where Caitlin Clark's impact became impossible to ignore. According to people familiar with Nike's athlete relations side, requests started coming in quietly. NBA players weren't asking for the latest LeBron or Kobe protos. They weren't looking for unreleased signature models tied to their own endorsement deals. They were asking a different question altogether: can I get the Caitlin Clark colorway? That had never happened before. WNBA players wearing NBA shoes has always been normal. The reverse, almost unheard of, especially at this scale. NBA athletes have access to the best footwear technology on the planet. Custom builds, one-off prototypes, entire teams of designers adjusting shoes specifically for their feet. So when players at that level start requesting a shoe tied to a women's basketball player, it sends a very loud message internally. It meant the appeal wasn't symbolic, it was functional. The design wasn't being chosen out of solidarity or curiosity. It was being chosen because it worked. Players reportedly loved the court feel, the responsiveness, and the balance between cushioning and lockdown. In a league where milliseconds matter and trust in your footwear is non-negotiable, that kind of adoption doesn't happen by accident. And here what made it even more disruptive: some of these players were under contract to promote other models. Yet behind the scenes, they were still asking Nike reps if they could secure Clark's PEs for workouts, practices, and even games where regulations allowed. That's the kind of behavior brands track obsessively because it reveals authentic preference, not compliance. Once word spread through locker rooms, curiosity turned into demand. Players talk, equipment managers talk. Suddenly, Clark's shoes weren't just a women's basketball success story. They were being discussed in the same breath as elite performance models across the sport. Inside Nike, this forced a recalibration. The company wasn't just seeing consumer demand anymore. It was seeing validation from the most demanding users imaginable. And when product credibility reaches that level, it changes how resources get allocated fast. Because at that point, this wasn't about gender, leagues, or labels. It was about one uncomfortable truth becoming clear. A women's basketball player had created a shoe good enough that NBA players wanted it more than what they were already being paid to wear. And once that happens, the rest of the industry has no choice but to pay attention. What happened next is where the idea of marketing hype completely falls apart, because this was Nike pulling strings or inflating demand. This was the market reacting in real time and losing control. Every time Caitlin Clark's player exclusives dropped, the same pattern followed. The release window opened, traffic spiked instantly, then the sites buckled, pages froze, checkouts failed. Within minutes, everything was gone, not discounted, not sitting in carts, gone. And the aftermath told the real story. Sneaker forums lit up with screenshots of failed purchase attempts. Fans posted error messages and countdown timers that never refreshed. Some waited hours in virtual queues only to come away empty-handed. This wasn't casual interest. This was frustration born from scarcity, the kind that only shows up when demand is real. Resale markets confirmed it. Prices doubled, then tripled, sometimes within hours of a drop. And this wasn't being driven by speculators alone. Many of the listings were from people who genuinely wanted the shoes but missed out. That distinction matters because resale driven purely by hype tends to cool quickly. This didn't. What made Nike uncomfortable was how little control they had over it. There were no influencer seeding campaigns pushing urgency, no viral stunts designed to fake scarcity. The shoes sold themselves the moment they appeared. And when Nike attempted to adjust supply carefully, conservatively, the result was the same. The market absorbed everything instantly. Internally, this forced a hard question. If limited releases were generating this level of chaos, what would happen with a full-scale launch? Would broader availability kill the excitement, or would it unlock something much bigger? Those aren't hypothetical questions inside a company like Nike. They're strategic ones, and the early indicators weren't subtle. Engagement metrics didn't drop between releases. Interest didn't fade with repetition. If anything, anticipation increased because people expected to miss out again. That's not how women's basketball footwear had ever behaved before. Historically, demand peaked early, then leveled off. Clark's releases did the opposite. Each drop created more attention than the last, more conversation, more urgency, more frustration. And frustration, in this context, is a signal of value. Because people don't get mad about missing out on things they don't care about. By this point, Nike wasn't just tracking sales, it was tracking behavior, how long people stayed on product pages, how quickly resale listings appeared, how often consumers came back for the next release even after failing the first time. And the conclusion was unavoidable. This wasn't a moment, it was momentum. Which is why the next phase of analysis went deeper, comparing Clark's impact not to women's basketball norms, but to the biggest signature athletes in the entire company. This is where the conversation inside Nike reportedly shifted from curiosity to consequence. Because once the chaos around Caitlin Clark's player exclusives refused to cool off, executives did what they always do next. They compared the numbers. And not against other women's basketball shoes. Against everything. Clark's PE performance was reportedly stacked alongside early cycle data from established signature athletes across the company. Players with championships, players with MVPs, players whose names have dominated sneaker culture for years. The goal wasn't to crown a winner, it was to understand scale. And according to people familiar with those internal discussions, the results were uncomfortable in the best possible way. Clark's releases weren't matching women's basketball benchmarks. They were competing with mainstream signature launches in engagement, sell-through speed, and sustained interest, not surpassing everyone, but landing close enough that the old assumptions no longer held. And in a data-driven company like Nike, that's the moment strategy changes. What stood out most wasn't just how fast the shoes sold. It was who was buying them. The overlap between basketball purists, sneaker collectors, casual fans, and younger consumers was wider than anything Nike had previously seen tied to a WNBA athlete. That kind of demographic crossover is rare, even among male stars. Internally, this forced a reframing. Clark wasn't being discussed as a women's basketball success anymore. She was being discussed as a category driver, someone capable of pulling new consumers into Nike's basketball ecosystem rather than just serving an existing niche. This is also where contrast became unavoidable. Other women's signature lines, including the A1 from A'ja Wilson, followed more traditional performance curves. Solid launches, predictable tapering, strong support from core fans, nothing wrong with that. In fact, that's what Nike had planned for. Clark broke that model. Her numbers didn't taper, they held. In some cases, they grew. Interest didn't fade between releases, it compounded. And for executives tasked with allocating marketing dollars and development resources, that distinction mattered more than accolades or resumes. This wasn't about diminishing anyone else's success. It was about recognizing where momentum was naturally forming. Brands don't create that kind of pull, they respond to it. By the end of those comparisons, the question inside Nike wasn't whether Clark deserved a signature shoe. That had already been answered. The question was how big to go, how much to invest, and whether women's basketball should finally be treated not as a subcategory, but as a legitimate growth engine. Because once data forces you to admit you've underestimated a market, the only real risk left is not acting fast enough. This is the part of the conversation that needs to be handled carefully, because it's also the part that gets misunderstood the most. Anytime A'ja Wilson and Caitlin Clark are mentioned in the same sentence, people rush to turn it into a debate about who's better at basketball. That's not what this is. On the court, A'ja Wilson's resume speaks for itself. Championships, MVPs, defensive dominance. She's one of the most accomplished players the league has ever seen, and nothing about sneaker sales changes that. But the sneaker market doesn't operate on basketball logic alone. When Wilson's A1 signature shoe launched under Nike, it followed a familiar, historically proven pattern: strong initial sales, broad retail availability, solid support from core fans of the WNBA. Exactly what brands have come to expect when they build around elite performance credentials. From a traditional standpoint, it was a success. What caught Nike off guard was how different Clark's trajectory looked by comparison. Clark's releases weren't supported by full retail saturation or heavy early distribution. They were limited, hard to get, and instead of demand leveling out, it intensified. Each drop didn't satisfy the market, it aggravated it. That difference isn't about respect or talent, it's about consumer behavior. Sneaker culture is driven by emotion as much as performance. Storylines matter, identity matters, how people feel when they buy a shoe matters. Clark's appeal tapped into something broader than basketball dominance. She became a symbol of range, confidence, and cultural crossover. Fans didn't just want her shoes because she wins. They wanted them because wearing them felt like participating in a moment. Wilson's brand, by contrast, has been built around excellence and consistency, traits that are incredibly valuable in sports, but historically harder to translate into sneaker frenzy without scarcity or crossover narratives. That doesn't make one better than the other. It highlights how different lanes exist within the same league. Inside Nike, this contrast reportedly sparked serious conversations, not about choosing one player over another, but about recognizing that different athletes drive different kinds of markets. Wilson represents stability and legacy. Clark represents expansion and disruption. And in business, disruption forces faster movement. This is where people get it wrong. It's not that Wilson underperformed. It's that Clark overperformed expectations in a way that reshaped the ceiling. Both can be true at the same time. The uncomfortable reality for brands is that cultural gravity doesn't always align perfectly with trophies. And once Nike saw proof that women's basketball could generate this kind of demand, the comparisons stopped being personal and became strategic. Because when the market speaks this clearly, companies don't argue with it, they adjust. Normally, this is where momentum dies. An injury, time away from the spotlight, fewer highlights, less noise. In most cases, brand heat cools fast when an athlete isn't actively playing. But with Caitlin Clark, the opposite happened, and that caught a lot of people off guard. During the 2025 offseason, Clark dealt with a knee issue that required careful management. No dramatic headlines, no long-term panic, just enough uncertainty to make you wonder whether the timing would slow everything down. From a branding perspective, that kind of pause usually introduces risk, less visibility, less urgency, less conversation. Instead, anticipation exploded. Every update about her recovery became its own mini-event. Fans weren't disengaging, they were waiting, and that waiting turned into a pressure cooker. The absence didn't erase demand, it concentrated it. Suddenly, everything connected to Clark felt scarce. Her return, her next game, and especially her upcoming signature shoe. This is where Nike's confidence became clearer. Rather than pulling back or delaying plans, Nike stayed the course. According to sneaker industry reporting, the CC1 signature shoe was targeted for a spring 2026 launch. That decision mattered. It signaled belief. Brands don't lock in major rollouts around athletes they're unsure about, especially in a category they've historically treated cautiously. Clark's own comments added weight to the moment. When she spoke about joining Nike's signature roster, a group filled with all-time greats, it wasn't framed as a personal achievement alone. It sounded like a milestone, one that acknowledged how rare this opportunity was and how seriously Nike was taking it. Behind the scenes, that confidence was backed by data. Engagement around Clark didn't dip during her time away. It grew, search interest held steady, social conversation intensified whenever her name surfaced. That told Nike something crucial. Her appeal wasn't dependent on constant exposure, it was durable. For marketers, that's gold. Athletes who can step away and still command attention are the ones brands build long-term strategies around. It means the connection isn't transactional, it's emotional. Fans weren't just following Clark because she was playing. They were invested in what came next. By the time whispers of the CC1 began circulating more widely, the environment was primed, not rushed, not desperate, ready. The injury period hadn't stalled the machine, it had loaded it. And that set the stage for Nike to do something it had never done before in women's basketball. Go all in, without hesitation, and without treating the moment like an experiment. Because once anticipation reaches that level, the only real mistake left is underestimating it again. This is where everything became unmistakably clear. Nike wasn't just reacting anymore. Nike was committing, and the scale of that commitment sent a message far beyond basketball. The campaign built around Caitlin Clark didn't look like a traditional women's basketball rollout. It looked like a flagship launch, mainstream, loud, unapologetic. The kind of marketing effort usually reserved for Nike's most valuable athletes, regardless of gender or league. That distinction mattered because it showed the company wasn't testing interest anymore. It believed the interest was already there. The creative direction alone raised eyebrows. This wasn't framed as supporting women's sports. It was framed as culture. From anywhere wasn't just a basketball slogan. It was a positioning statement, placing Clark alongside the broader Nike universe rather than inside a niche. That choice told consumers how to see her before they even saw the product. Then there was the shoe itself. Sources familiar with the development process have said the CC1 wasn't a repackaged model with new colors and a signature logo. It was built from the ground up. Nike's design team reportedly worked directly around Clark's play style, her deep shooting range, quick release, footwork under pressure, and need for stability when pulling up at speed. Every performance choice was intentional. That level of customization is expensive. Brands don't do it unless they expect serious return. What made the investment even more convincing was what happened once early performance feedback circulated. NBA players who had access to the tech reportedly praised the court feel, cushioning balance, and lockdown fit. When athletes who have worn everything Nike offers start talking positively without being prompted, that feedback carries more weight than any ad campaign. Internally, this validated the strategy. Nike wasn't just betting on Clark's popularity, it was betting on her credibility as a performance standard. That's a different tier of athlete, one who influences not just fans, but peers. Financial projections reportedly reflected that confidence. Analysts began revising expectations for women's basketball footwear as a category, not just for one shoe. Clark's line was positioned to challenge first-year sales assumptions across the board, including some men's partnerships that had been considered untouchable benchmarks. And that's the real shift. This wasn't about proving women's basketball could sell shoes. That argument was already outdated. This was about realizing it could lead. Once Nike crossed that line internally, there was no going back. Because when the world's biggest sports brand stops treating something like a risk and starts treating it like a growth engine, the industry follows. And at that point, Caitlin Clark wasn't just a signature athlete anymore. She was the standard that forced everyone else to rethink what women's basketball could be worth. This is the part of the story that goes beyond sneakers, sales charts, or marketing campaigns. Because what happened with Caitlin Clark wasn't just a breakout moment. It was a line being crossed, quietly, permanently, and without permission from anyone who used to decide what women's basketball was worth. For decades, the ceiling was assumed: limited demand, limited investment, limited ambition. Brands didn't openly dismiss women's basketball, but they didn't fully believe in it either. They planned small because they expected small, and for a long time, that expectation became self-fulfilling, until the data stopped cooperating. Clark didn't change the game by asking for more support. She changed it by forcing the market to prove it was already there. NBA players wearing her colorways dropped selling out before they could be refreshed. Analytics teams rewriting projections in real time. Those aren't symbolic wins, those are structural ones. What makes this moment different from past breakthroughs is sustainability. This wasn't a viral spike tied to one tournament or one highlight. It held, it compounded. It pulled in consumers who had never engaged with women's basketball footwear before and kept them coming back. That's when something stops being a moment and starts being a market. And the ripple effects matter. When Nike commits at this level and sees returns, it changes internal playbooks. Budgets grow, risk tolerance shifts. Other athletes get opportunities that didn't exist before. Clark's success doesn't close doors behind her, it opens them wider for everyone coming next. That's why the constant framing of this story as a rivalry misses the point. This was never about one player replacing another. It was about proof that women's basketball can drive culture, not just participate in it. Proof that performance, personality, and connection can intersect at scale when brands stop treating the category like an experiment. The industry won't admit it out loud, but this moment forced a recalibration. What seemed impossible a few years ago now looks inevitable in hindsight, and that's usually how real change shows up, not with announcements, but with numbers no one can argue against. So whatever happens next with the CC1 launch, the return to the court, or future campaigns, one thing is already locked in. The perception has shifted, the investment followed, and the excuse that women's basketball can't carry commercial weight doesn't survive this chapter. Because once a market proves itself, it doesn't ask to be taken seriously anymore. It expects it.